amid Eastern Asia and Pacific countries, among upper middle income countries, and in the global cohort. Indonesia scores in the middle tercile in terms of rank for its overall rule of law index score. We did not see a ton of movement this year in any of the factors, although there was a statistically significant decline in factor 1, measuring constraints on government powers, and that was a deterioration of...
In the whole 9 years, the situation is more or less stagnant. 0.1, 0.2, 0.2, 0.2, 0.1, 5.1, 5.1 again, and then 5.3. Then now 53.
Concerning.
Now,
so
in the whole 9 years. So based on that, what do you expect to to
a change
to
in
have
a year?
something different?
What is happening around the globe actually is authoritarianism is totally like dominating.
Populism.
Do you see that kind of symptoms happening?
Absolutely, yeah. Authoritarianism has been on the rise.
On the rise.
Yes.
Yeah.
Halo Pojok Keramat, apa kabar? Senang sekali kita balik lagi ngobrol di Pojok Keramat. Ini adalah program dari YouTube official dari Profesor Mahfud MD, Mahfud MD Official, di mana ini memang disengaja diniatkan untuk menjadi ajang diskusi kritis untuk menegakkan demokrasi, menegakkan etika, dan juga tentunya untuk merawat keberagaman. Dan, here's the interesting fact that please allow me to change my language a little bit from Bahasa Indonesia to English, because I would like to appreciate our folk here who came all the way from the United States, from the Washington DC, to talk and elaborate more on a very interesting index that would be very important to predict probably the future of democracy.
Sure.
Probably, right? The future of political stability in Indonesia. That is a rule of law index. And I would like you to introduce our friend here, Erin Campbell. Hi.
Hi.
Welcome to our lovely studio.
Thank you.
Erin Campbell is a senior program associate from the WJP, or World Justice Project, right? From Washington DC.
Yes.
So thank you for coming to Jakarta.
Yeah, thank you for having me here.
Of course. It's pleasure for us. Bang Hamid, seperti biasa, gimana Bang Hamid kabarnya?
Baik.
All good?
Yeah.
All good. Okay.
Because you speak English, I do it.
Okay.
First. Thank you for having me.
Okay, but you know what, Pojok Keramat, you don't have to write your aspirations or criticism in English. Boleh ngomong pakai bahasa Indonesia, tetap di kolom komentar. Nanti kita akan bacakan seperti biasa. Tapi langsung aja, saya ingin mengelaborasi lebih lanjut terkait dengan Global Rule of Law Index. I would like to elaborate more on that. But before probably we have deeper discussion on that, would you please give us the overview of what is the Global Rule of Law Index?
Absolutely. The WJP Rule of Law Index is a quantitative assessment tool that measures how well 142 countries and jurisdictions around the world adhere to principles of the rule of law. We measure this through original survey data coming from a couple of different sources. The first of which is a general population poll. So these are surveys administered to ordinary people living in each of the countries we measure. And the second source is a series of expert questionnaires, or what we call our qualified respondents questionnaires. And those are answered by lawyers, legal practitioners, academics, professors, people who are interacting with the justice systems and institutions of a country on a day-to-day basis and are in tune to how those various mechanisms perform on a day-to-day basis. And so this survey data is organized into 8 factors of the rule of law that form the foundation of our overall rule of law scores that we give each of the countries in the index.
And those are?
These are constraints on government powers, absence of corruption, open government, fundamental rights, order and security, regulatory enforcement, civil justice, and criminal justice.
Okay, so what's the appealing result from 2024 Rule of Law Index globally?
So this year's index comes out of 7 consecutive years of declines in the rule of law. For the 7th year in a row, more countries have declined than improved in the rule of law. So that's not the appealing part.
That's not appealing. But are you surprised with that?
Appealing enough, I think.
Are you surprised with that?
Yeah, sure. For sure.
Okay. Yeah, but what we're seeing this year is that the proportion of countries that are declining versus those that are improving is beginning to reduce in percentage. So it's not as stark a majority that is declining. And then there are some improvements coming out of a variety of countries. Poland this year was our most improved country in rule of law score, coming off of their recent elections. And Thailand and Vietnam both were among the top 5 improvers in rule of law score this year.
Oh, wow.
Another interesting finding from this year is that for the first time since 2019, a majority of countries improved their absence of corruption score around the world, including Indonesia.
Including Indonesia,
Yes.
That's amazing.
Is significant change or significant?
In Indonesia, it's a small change. It's a small
change.
improvement. And I think in general this year, we're not seeing a lot of really dramatic movements in the rule of law. I think coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're seeing some of the trends that emerged from that time play out, I suppose.
Okay, since you mentioned about the absence of corruption, and Indonesia has shown an improved result this year, that is intriguing. Before you elaborate more on the data, I would like to jump into that statement first. So, how would that possible? Seeing Hamid smiling.
She does not believe in your findings.
You know what?
Sorry.
Well, I could not believe that the result is seen improved if we compare to the news and the vibe that civil society has been feeling about Indonesia's Indonesian law enforcement on corruption, for example, or all the weakening of the KPK law, for example, the Corruption Commission. Isn't that kind of paradoxical?
So I'm glad you brought up the KPK. One of the most deteriorated subfactors of the index for Indonesia this year was 1.3, and that is not necessarily under the corruption factor, but it measures how strong independent institutions are at controlling the reach of government powers and in monitoring and auditing those institutions. And so while the score for corruption may have improved, that's not to say that we aren't seeing some negative movements in other areas that could explain some of what you're seeing in Indonesia this year. I also want to mention that while there were some modest improvements in Factor 2, absence of corruption, the score value still remains quite low. It is Indonesia's second lowest performing factor of the Rule of Law Index under only criminal justice. And so we do expect to see some fluctuations in score year to year. The index is not specific enough to establish causality or point to certain current events or policies that may have caused our scores to move one way or another. But overall, when we look at its performance in corruption, it's still an area for improvement.
Slightly better.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that's a good sign, right, Bang Hamid?
Yeah, because I think it's been every single day, so you're being bombarded with the corruption news.
Right, and this is also somewhat counterintuitive, but what we find with the index is that countries that have very publicized instances of corruption, in many cases, these stories are not celebrating the corruption. You know, they are holding these officials accountable to some degree, if not through government mechanisms, through the press and other checks on power. And so for how our index measures corruption and how well countries deal with that, having publicized corruption cases where it is brought to light, where it's talked about in society and acknowledged, that could be seen as an improvement because something is being done to address that corruption.
Okay.
But I think this one of the important thing, one of the useful thing with this kind of survey or research is just to to counter the impression or perceptions like you do, because they do it in.
That's good for branding.
Not only branding, but they try to make some solid base for some claim. Yeah, it's different with some subjective impression, subjective perception. Yeah. But I think, as Erin says, in many variables, is the big picture is still murky for Indonesia. Yeah, so don't worry. so don't worry. Our country is still murky. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm not sure whether I should be not to worry or I should started to get scared about that.
You're disappointed.
Okay. Anyway, that's actually my next question. So how is it overall, the score, Indonesian score for the rule of law index?
In 2024,
definitely.
Yes, the overall score this year did not change since last year. I don't have my figures in front of me, but I believe it scored 0.53. Is that correct?
Oh, okay. 68th as the ranked. Is that right?
Yes. Okay. So amid Eastern Asia and Pacific countries, among upper middle income countries, and in the global cohort, Indonesia scores in the middle tercile in terms of rank for its overall rule of law index score. We did not see a ton of movement this year in any of the factors, although there was a statistically significant decline in factor 1, measuring constraints on government powers, and that was a deterioration of 0.02. And I should mention that the scores are on a scale from 0 to 1, with 1 being a perfect score in rule of law.
Is it related to the recent election that we just upheld?
So our data collection period for the 2024 index was between February and June this year. So some of the surveys would have been collected before the elections, and moreover, we do find that there is somewhat of a delay in the public's perception of certain rule of law issues after big changes in a country.
Okay, so Indonesia is ranked 68th out of 142 countries you mentioned. So it's quite in the middle. What does it mean for Indonesia? Is it just okay?
Yes,
or is
perfectly
it
okay?
Yeah.
Not satisfying?
Yeah, so yeah.
Yeah. It's a good question, and I think to interpret the results of the index, it's important to look at this as a comparative tool. The numbers alone don't mean a lot without the context of other countries' performances and having those benchmarks to compare against. So looking at the East Asian Pacific countries, Indonesia is 9th out of 15. So
that's quite low. 9 out of 15.
It's lower, yeah. Although among Southeast Asian countries, it's 3rd out of 8th.
Okay.
So it is a middle score in the index, and I think.
Okay.
But Indonesia is the 3rd in the rank of Southeast Asia.
Yes.
Up of us is Malaysia and Singapore.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
But I think Singapore is not democracy. What do you think about it? How you can rank our country in the 3rd in compare with something undemocratic countries?
Sure. So one of, or I guess the methodology of the index and how we measure and apply scores to various aspects of the rule of law is through outcome-oriented questions. So what this means is that we do not, in our methodology, say that your government needs to look a certain way or be structured a certain way, but a citizen who needs to, redress issues in a court of law for some kind of legal problem, they should be able to do that on a timely basis. They should be able to access that process. It should be affordable. They should be aware of their rights. And so to make our scores and rankings and our calculations comparable on that global level, our questions focus on how people experience the rule of law in their daily lives, and not what is on the books, not written laws, but how it is, what practical effects it has on people's day-to-day lives. So for Singapore to achieve a high result, I don't have the country profile in front of me, but its strengths and the areas in which it performs more strongly compared to regional peers would be based on those outputs and how people are able to navigate rule of law issues in their everyday lives.
Okay. Well, I think in the Economist Intelligence Unit Democracy Index, I think Singapore is also still higher than Indonesia, if you mentioned that Singapore
really?
is undemocratic.
Well, I don't buy it. As for
what do you say about that?
Based on the parameter or the methodology of the WGP conduct, Singapore for sure, I think no maybe fundamental rights. 4 of 8 the parameters, fundamental rights, and I think it's not good in Singapore in that sense. And maybe the best of Singapore in that sense is one of the 8 parameters, that is the absence of corruption. Singapore is very clear that it's a clear nation, a clear country, but I think for other parameters is the situation is, I think, is not as good as the WGP do with the rank. You know what I mean?
Of course.
That's, I'm just wondering why. Even compared to Malaysia, I think our democracy is much more vibrant.
Why do you think that?
Than Malaysia, or let alone Singapore. Our democracy is clearly more vibrant. We are free press here. We don't have free court, of course, but we have free press. For example, and free press is one of the important indicator for the status whether a country can be democratic or not democracy.
Okay, I think that is intriguing. So my question is that, do you think overall, if we talk about rule of law, does it always go in line with democracy?
That's important thing.
What do you think about that, Erin?
Well,
I think it is correlated, and there are a number of principles of the rule of law that align well with democracy, having civic participation, having free and open press, upholding the same rights for every kind of citizen, every demographic group. It's I don't have any figures necessarily on the correlation, but I think there is a lot of overlap in the principles that we measure and what one would consider a strong democracy.
Yeah. Overall, it should be in line. For some extent.
Yeah, sure.
So, Bang Hamid, what do you think? How do you feel about Indonesia being in the 68th rank? How do you see that project, Indonesian democracy or rule of law? Definitely.
Well, in the sense of rule of law, I think it's not so surprising.
Not so surprising.
Yeah, as a activist, I think we follow these things day by day, on daily basis, so we can see. And I think in this sense, the WGP just to confirming what we
experience
what we call about the situation. So in that sense, we thank them. Yeah, because
definitely
by their research, we can make a statement with much more bold and solid arguments, solid basis.
Exactly.
That's what they want. But with that thing, I just to go to a different level to your organization. This is ambitious for sure. It's very important, but at the same time, it's ambitious, very ambitious project. Yeah? You can say it political project or even legal project. Yeah? But actually, what the assumption or what the big ideas behind this ambitious project? I mean, you cannot stop, or you cannot think that's enough to portray situation in that sense, in the rule of law situation in every country that you do conducting research. Yeah. But in my opinion, you should have some, ideas or some proposes to, in general, make it better situation. So what the driving force or the idea behind this?
One of the key tenets of the World Justice Project is to create knowledge and build awareness of rule of law issues around the world. And as you're saying, the Rule of Law Index as a global quantitative tool does not go into depth into the context and political situation of every country. But it does provide a good starting place to have those conversations. Talking about improving a country's rule of law, I mean, just defining the rule of law can be a very complicated process, and there are a lot of different aspects of government and rights and
after all, it's not WGP business, right?
Right.
For every country.
Okay, so I would like to bring it back to Indonesia, actually. I'm curious, since you mentioned that the 8th factor is the criminal justice, right? Criminal justice. Indonesia has the lowest score from the rule of law index today. What makes it really bad, actually?
So I don't, I wish I had the country profile in front of me right now to go into the specifics, but first of all, criminal justice is a factor that a lot of countries struggle with. I think it is one of the lowest performing factors for a lot of different countries around
and getting
every
worse,
region.
In general, getting worse everywhere. You mean that?
Yeah, it's definitely not getting better. But within Indonesia and again, globally, one of the sub-factors that countries really struggle with is 8.3, which measures the effectiveness of correctional institutions and prisons and recidivism rates and whether due process is upheld in prisons, whether people have adequate accommodations or are treated humanely. And that's one of the lower scores for that factor.
Okay, so Bang Hamid, in context of Indonesia, do you think what has been the result of the rule of law index could
what?
Can we hope for a better result next year if you see from the new government, because your data is from the previous government?
You mean next year? Really next year? Nothing happened for next year.
So that's a very bitter answer, actually.
I mean, this is something that you can hope for. You can hope for very short term. Yeah. Some of analysts says that if this thing can be improved in 25 years, it would be good.
Okay.
They say it's about 5 elections to improve the situation. Maybe. Yeah. Let alone for our country. Yeah. Our country is so big. Maybe something or some aspects better in some area in East Java, for example, but so many things getting worse or as bad as before in, let's say, Kalimantan, because this is archipelagic country, the biggest in the world. So I think it's safe to say that the improvement can be happen in 25, 30 years from now.
Probably it's going to be just a similar score next year. Is that what you predict?
Yeah. In the a year before, the score is the same, right?
Yeah. I saw the chart.
And I saw from his brilliant presentation today that in 9 years, in the whole 9 years, the situation is more or less stagnant. 0.1, 0.2, 0.2, 0.2, 0.1, 5.1, 5.1 again, and then 5.3. Then now 53.
Concerning.
Now.
So
in the whole 9 years. So based on that, what do you expect to to
a change
to
in a
have
year?
Something different in the some years to come?
Yeah.
You cannot.
That's concerning. So, Erin, could you please talk more about that chart, actually? So, if we think about how the chart looks like, the improvement is very, very small. What is happening around the globe, actually? Is authoritarianism is totally like dominating?
Populism?
Do you see that kind of symptoms happening?
Absolutely, yeah. Authoritarianism has been on the rise.
On the rise.
Yes, especially coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw a lot of governments enact emergency powers that are helpful in the context of an emergency, where you need to make fast decisions and get people the support they need. However, coming out of the pandemic, a lot of the effects of that concentration of power and executive control still remain. And so this year, we saw a majority of countries decline in their scores for Factor 1, constraints on government powers, as well as Factor 4, which measures fundamental rights, both of which correlate with this trend we're seeing with the rise of authoritarian governments.
Okay, so well, that's interesting. Do you think this authoritarianism could how could the government change? I mean, or probably if it's not the government, then society, because they are the one who will be impacted with the rule of law index, whether small, high or low, right? So how could the society change this? Do you think some kind of cultural revolution or something would help?
Wow.
Or necessary?
It's a very harsh word, cultural revolution. Remembering us about what happened in China.
Yeah.
Come on, for the whole 10 years.
I mean that's also interesting with the chart that you mentioned. See, from the past 20 years or 9 years you mentioned, the improvement, or probably if it's slowing down, it's also like 0.2. Yeah, very stagnant.
Sure.
So in 9 years, 20 years, 10 years is quite a also a long time, probably also a big deal to have some sort of cultural reform, some sort. So do you think that would help? Do you think that's what people should do?
So I'm not a policymaker, so I don't pretend to have the answers to
as a society,
questions.
You're only a surveyor, we know that.
I'm giving you a hard time. I'm really sorry about that.
It's okay.
That being said, some of the measures that we include in our factor 1 on constraints on government powers, when we see a country with healthy checks and balances, there is a big role for nonprofits and independent auditing organizations to play in that. And, you know, in line with the mission of the World Justice Project, being able to provide data and evidence of these issues and how they impact people is a really powerful tool in calling negative trends in government to attention. And, you know, the first step in addressing these issues is defining them and figuring out where are the weaknesses. And so I do think that from, you know, a societal perspective, being able to support free media and participating in politics, you know, voting, being an active member of civic life, those are both areas in which citizens can work to improve these trends.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, since you previously mentioned about Poland has the most significant improved this year, so could you please talk more about that, and how can we learn from Poland in that sense?
Well, I don't know off the top of my head which factors Poland improved in, but they did have elections this year that resulted in a more, and here I am saying democratic and trying not to necessarily make that the same word as rule of law, but they have shifted toward a more democratic system this year. And so I think that kind of political participation and empowering citizens to be aware of their rights and aware of what their government should be able to do for them is a good step.
But is it the development in Poland is only happened and it's a very good development is only this year, or how about
the previous
year and previous years, even though not the next years?
Sure. I believe the improvement was...
is it consistent? I mean, let's say in 5 years?
Sure. I don't think it has been a consistent improvement over time. But again, I'd have to take a look at that data to be sure.
Okay. Bang Hamid, she also mentioned, you also mentioned about Thailand.
Thailand
has been the top 5 improver this year. Not top 5 on rule of law index, but improver this year. So what do you think, Bang Hamid? Do you have opinion about that, Thailand, our neighbor?
It's a bit strange too for me, because we see what happened in Thailand before. Some 1 or 2 years ago, there was a very young and brilliant politician who was dismissed from the contestation, like for example, by the military, for example. And well, mainly Thailand is a kingdom anyway, not a democratic state. I think the more impressive thing is Vietnam, right?
Vietnam,
the degree of improvement is, I think, it's higher, and it's surprising me. Not because I lamentation about it. I admire Vietnamese society, because I don't know if the credit is for society or the government, but the fact is they are getting better improvement in the very high degree, even though still, I'm sorry to say, under our country in the rank, right?
In the overall rule of law.
but the percentage of the improvement is impressive. Vietnam.
Okay, so what about in our country? We did a significant change in 1998.
I mean the reformasi.
The reformasi, right? And it was also about law and also change in politics overall, very significant. How do you think that affect our rule of law today?
No, I think first of all we have to realize that what happened in 1998 is a dramatic change in political sphere, in political domain. There are many new institutions, new democratic institutions like KPK, the Komisi Yudisial, and so on and so on. It's that all are good. But in the domain of rule of law, culture, actually it's nothing significant happened until now. So we can say that in that sphere, the situation is like the survey that they conducted, stagnant. It's not getting better, for sure. Even though I don't know, maybe it's not getting worse too, but for sure it's not getting better in terms of rule of law. Even though our constitution says that our country is based on law, the Rechtsstaat, and we can translate it easily to the rule of law, even though some scholars says that it's different culture, different tradition, but the continental law and the continental and what? Apa satunya?
The what?
Anglo-Saxon. Anglo-Saxon is rule of law is Anglo-Saxon tradition, and our tradition is following the continental law. But I think it's not significant. I think it's for the sake of discussion we can make both identical. First one is the Rechtsstaat, and the second one is rule of law. I think it's the same thing. We talk about the same thing. And in that sense, nothing significant improvement happened, sadly.
That's a pity. Erin, to conclude, actually, what would you say?
The time is out?
The time is out!
Okay.
Should we extend for another hour?
Okay.
So to conclude, Erin, what would you say to the government, definitely, because they play a massive role to enact the rule of law, and also to society that experience the impact of the rule of law? What would you say to both of them? Probably for the government first, and then to the society.
Sure. From my perspective as a researcher and someone who works in data collection, I think that one of our best tools for accountability is data and providing this information and tracking performance over time. And so a tool like the index, I would say, is a great place for governments to start and look year after year, where are the strengths, where are the weaknesses, and keep track of that information. Buy in or invest, or not necessarily monetarily, but just have that be something of value, something that is important to policy making, to decision making, and use those kinds of metrics as ways to identify priorities for change. And to citizens, to everyday people, I think that supporting sources of this information and engaging with research and free media and people who are having these important discussions, I think that's a great way to stay informed and remain aware of what powers you have as a person living in a country to participate in your government and make improvements.
Rely on reliable data.
Sure.
Yeah,
like WJP report.
Yeah, because data now is a new gold.
Yeah.
Before we talk about landlord, now data lord, who amassed, have a big data, huge data, they become the ruler,
Right.
have the power. So they say about data lord now, not landlord anymore.
Now data lord.
Data lord.
Yeah, thanks to internet. You've changed everything, internet. Okay, anyway, Bang Hamid, so what would you say about the overall rule of law index, and how would you hope for the future looking at the index today?
I think I told you about that, the very long, we have to wait a bit longer to change things that as important as the rule of law principle. But I just want to appreciate Erin and her colleagues in World Justice Project. I think these organizations, what they do is very, very important, and I think it's timely, because we talk about, the race of the populism, blah, blah, blah. And in general, it's some violation to the principle of rule of law. So what they do in World Justice Project in Washington, I think is very good and very useful and very benefiting for humankind, no less than that, in that scale. So congratulations, Erin, for your
impressive work. Impressive
yeah.
work.
Yeah, and they are getting, maybe larger. Now, so far, they get 142 countries. It's a serious thing.
Of course, it's a big deal.
Thing. It's a money consumption too, and
of course.
I just admire why there are some people in this world, in America, have that amount of money and want to spending this money to something that's, I think, not has direct benefit for themselves.
Profit.
So we respect in this effort. Yeah.
Of course. Erin, thank you so much for your amazing work with the WJP team. I really hope that the government would also watch the podcast, or at least to look at your data, to reflect on how they should, enforce the rule, enact the rule of law in the future. I think this is a very impactful work. So congratulations. And thank you so much.
Thank you. And on that note, I want to plug that all of the data in the Rule of Law Index, as well as historical scores and rankings back to 2015, are available to the public on our website. For free, yes. WorldJusticeProject.org.
God bless you. God bless you, Erin, and WJP team. Okay, so thank you so much for joining us. Pojok Keramat, please feel free untuk ramein kolom komentar seperti biasa. Nanti kita akan bacain di next episode. Atau boleh dong kasih saran juga, mungkin next mau ngobrolin apa?
Atau pakai bahasa apa?
Bahasa jangan bahasa Indonesia atau Inggris. Maksudnya jangan di luar Indonesia atau Inggris. Saya nggak bisa bahasa yang di luar itu.
Just kidding.
Dan atau mungkin seru juga ya, narasumbernya siapa yang didatengin ya. Seru ya Bang Hamid ya. Oke, kalau gitu kita jumpa lagi di next episode. Thank you, Intan Bedisa signing out. Bye. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you, Erin.